It's so good to see all of you here tonight for our Wednesday night Bible study. I hope that you had a good day today. I know that Wednesday usually makes for a long day for most everyone in here. So I hope that tomorrow is going to be a little bit of a relief for you. And we'll be looking forward to Friday. So we're glad that you're here on this cold night. And we're going to begin tonight in Matthew chapter 6. So if you have your Bibles, we invite you to Matthew chapter 6. We're going to continue our study in the book of Matthew. And hopefully talk about some things that are a little bit different than what we normally talk about from our class in the Bible today. There was one girl, she was bored in church, and she was watching the plate go around. People were putting all their money in, and she asked her mom, she said, "Mama, if we give him the money, can we go home?" You know, church to her was just something that you did and you just came and put your money in and left. It's interesting what Jesus talks about when he addresses the subject of giving in the first part of Matthew chapter 6. Let's notice verse 1. "Take heed that you do not your alms before men to be seen of them. Otherwise you have no reward of your Father which is in heaven." What in the world are alms? It's not translated many times in the Bible. You know, I always think of this cartoon that I watched when I was a kid. It's Robin Hood the movie, but it's the cartoon movie. How many of you have ever seen that before, by the way? Okay. Most of the younger folks in here probably like that, but I always liked that movie when I was a boy, and I specifically remember one scene when I saw this word, it jumped out at me. There was one scene where the character that played Robin Hood was a fox. And he was dressed up in a hoodie and sunglasses and a cane. And he was saying this line over and over again. He was saying, "Alms for who? The poor." What in the world does that mean? Okay, yeah, an offering. You know, a lot of times they would give a lot of things to the poor. I'm reminded of a man in Acts chapter 3. We'll notice it in just a moment. But he was waiting at the gate of the temple. And what was he waiting for? For people to give him alms as they went into the temple. So it's interesting. This word alms, it's not something that we normally see today or even practice today. Usually when we give, where do we give? We give in the collection at church, right? This word, I looked at the root word for this. It literally has the root meaning from the word mercy. I thought that was kind of weird. The literal translation, the LITV, the literal version, translates this merciful deed. So it talks about Jesus, when Jesus is teaching, it said, "Take heed that you do not do your merciful deeds before men to be seen of them." How many of your translations say righteous deeds? Okay, I got one over there. I found that too when I was studying for this. This would include all kinds of different things. Of course, it would be giving of money, that would be one, but it would be giving of all kinds of things that are helpful. Okay? And they would give these things to the poor. All right, what does it mean? Do not your alms before men to be seen of them. Sure. In the eyes of man. Yeah, that's right. Look at me. Look what I'm giving. Sometimes the right things can be done with the wrong motive. Is that true or false? It's true. That's what Jesus is talking about. It's interesting. He just finished this idea in the earlier chapter, in chapter 5, when he said, "Let your light shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify" who? Your Father who's in heaven. So this idea continues throughout his sermon that he's teaching here on the Sermon on the Mount. All right, let's read a little bit further here. Let's look at verse 2. "Therefore, when thou doest thine alms, do not sound a trumpet before thee as the hypocrites do." That phrase, "sound a trumpet," stood out to me because what do we usually say about someone who brags a lot? What do? They toot their own horn. I always thought that was when I saw this, I always wondered if that was came from a biblical thought there. Certainly seems biblical to me. But he said, don't toot your own horn, right? Like the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have the glory of men. Now notice, verily I say unto you, they have their reward. Now in verse 1, he said they do not have any reward from the Father. But what is their reward?
The praise of men.
The praise of men. You know, the Bible addresses the Pharisees and how they desired the praises of men. In fact, I think about John chapter 12 when it says, they believed in Jesus, but they would not confess Him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue, for they loved the praises of men more than the praises of God. So Jesus says, for Christians, we need to try to reject that. Now, there are positions of leadership where you have to be out front. I mean, you just have to. And I'll be honest with you, in a lot of ways, I don't like it. It makes me uncomfortable. But if you're going to accomplish anything as a leader, you just have to stand up and do what you're supposed to do and then sit back down. Well, I think sometimes if we're not careful, in all areas of leadership, we can sort of get this idea like, hey, look at me, look what I'm doing. Well, Jesus, He's condemning that idea. He said, no, if a man wants to be a leader, he's first got to humble himself. Well, I don't think the Pharisees were too good at that. That when they came into the temple, you know, they like to ring a bell, you know, and said, oh, we're going to church. We're going to let everybody know we're going to church. You know, I never forget when I was in Fiji, and mind you that half of the Fijian population is Indian. Okay, so half of the people that live in Fiji are from India. And every night when we were teaching in the gospel meeting, you hear this loud prayer in Islam all throughout the entire city. So here I am trying to preach the gospel, and about 7:30, 8 o'clock, or sometime around, I can't remember exactly what time it was, every single night, this loud Arabic prayer came for the entire town of Lumbasa, Fiji to hear. You would see these same people in the marketplace during the daytime. And guess how they were dressed? They stood out like a sore thumb. You know, when I think about principles like that, I'm thinking about what Jesus is teaching here. He said, just be religious, but be oblivious to it. Don't be the best man in the room. Because when we walk in the city that is full of people that need the gospel, yes, we want to be a shining light to them, but we don't want to be a sore thumb on them. See? We don't want to make them, oh man, them Christians, they're just better than everybody. They think they're just goody two-shoes. They're better than all of us.
Doesn't that kind of go along with Paul when he said when he was in certain areas, he did certain things. He never went against God's word, but when Rome was as a Roman, and he was, you know, different. He became whatever it needed to be able to reach the gospel.
Sure enough. Something I love about the Apostle Paul's attitude, like you said, he said, to the Jew I became as a Jew, to the Greek I became as a Greek. But he always remembered where he came from. He was a murderer. He thought of himself as the most guilty person on earth, and he said, by the grace of God, I am what I am. And he tried to save people so that by the grace of God they could be what they are too. All right, now, so let's talk about this. I want to give you some scriptures about these alms not being done before men, but I want to sort of give an idea of what these are. Let's go to Acts chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, and Acts chapter 9 and verse 36, and Acts chapter 10, verses 1 and 2. It's interesting to me that this idea is a Jewish idea. Okay, so when you're reading about this, you don't really read about giving alms past the book of Acts. Okay? You read about giving. You read about the collection of the saints for the church. But it was weird to me that this is like an Old Testament Jewish idea, this giving the alms in the temple. Okay? I'll show you what I mean. Acts chapter 3. Will somebody read that, verses 1 and 2? Okay. It's also interesting to me that Peter and John are going to the temple. When the Old Testament law and everything about the Jewish system has already been nailed to the cross. Why in the world do you think they're doing that? That's right. They're taking the gospel of Jesus Christ to the Jews first, just like Jesus told them to do. Jesus sent out the 70 on a limited commission in Matthew chapter 10, and He told them, go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. They are going to hear the gospel first. When you come to Acts chapter 10, you read of the first Gentile convert. What was his name? Cornelius. And for the first time, the gospel went to the Gentiles. But for now, and up until Acts chapter 10, even after that, you're going to read about the apostles going into the synagogues, going into the temple to try to find religious people to convert them. And what they were doing is, they were going into worship and they saw this man and they were going to give him these alms. All right, Acts chapter 9, verse 36. It says, there was at Joppa a certain disciple named Tabitha, which by interpretation is called Dorcas. This woman was full of good works, and notice, and alms deeds, which she did. Then you come to Acts chapter 10, verses 1 and 2. You read about Cornelius, and it says, he was a good man. He was one that prayed to God always, and he gave much alms to the people. But let me ask you something. Was Cornelius saved or lost? He was lost. In fact, you'll read about his account, his conversion. And it tells about how he and his house should be saved later in Acts chapter 11. He was a good man, but he was good and lost. He didn't know the truth yet. So Peter came to him from a vision that God revealed to Peter, and he told Peter to go to Cornelius' house and teach him the gospel, and he did. And Cornelius obeyed the gospel, thankfully. But just because he was giving alms, just because he prayed to God always, it didn't make him saved. He didn't understand the truth yet. But when he did understand it, and when he was taught it, he obeyed it. And then he was saved. All right. Any question or comment before we go on? Okay. We'll talk about this reward for a minute. In Matthew chapter 6 and verse 1, he said, if they do this to be seen of men, there is no reward of your Father which is in heaven. But what if they don't do it to be seen of men? Is there a reward? Sure. Yeah, definitely. Do you think of any passages that come to mind about giving and God giving a reward when we give? There's always a passage that stands out in my mind when I think about giving. And it's the passage that said, God loves a what? A cheerful giver. That's in 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 7. Okay, it says, every man according as he purposeth in his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly nor of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver. But the very verse before it, in verse 6, do you remember what he mentions? He who sows sparingly shall reap also sparingly. He who sows bountifully shall reap also bountifully. He's talking about a reward. People who give, they get a lot in return. You know, Jesus said in Luke chapter 6 and verse 38, "Give, and it shall be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down and shaken together and running over, shall men give unto your bosom. For with what measure you meet, it shall be measured to you again." You know what Jesus is picturing there in Luke chapter 6 and verse 38? He says, good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over. It's like a bucket of grain. Yesterday, one of my daughters, you know, she's hit this little stage where she's, I guess, trying to be a little bit rebellious. And I told her, I gave them rules. I said, look, every time y'all say something mean to each other, number one, you're going to go to your room. That's the first time. The second time, you're going to do yard work. The third time, you're going to get a whipping. So it was her turn to do the yard work. So we went outside yesterday afternoon and we started raking them leaves up. And I'd rake them up in a big old pile and she'd shovel them in the trash can. Get to the top, we push it down. Put more leaves in there. I mean, we just kept on pushing them down. We kept on putting them in. When the pile was there, it looked like it'd be 10 bags. It was 4. So me and her together. We was out there raking them leaves and she was shoveling them in. She's doing this number here. Oh, my arms are sore. I was thinking, well, good. Yeah, they need to be sore. Tired of y'all fighting all the time. Well, that's what Jesus is picturing. He said, look, when a person knows how to give, you can't outgive God. There's a reward for that. Jesus is talking about this teaching in this passage. He said, but if we do it to be seen of everybody else, we say, oh man, I'm such a good giver. I can outgive everybody. So, God doesn't even care about what you're giving now. It doesn't matter what I put in the plate. I could put $500 a week in there, and it don't matter. Jesus even went so far, he said, don't even let your right hand know what your left hand does. It's funny because, have you ever seen, I see this overseas sometimes, but I don't really see it in the United States, but have you ever seen when people give, they give in a bag? You ever notice that? They've got wooden handles and a leather bag. Has anybody ever seen that? That's like old-timey. We always do the plates here in America, but sometimes overseas they'll pass around the collection and it's a wooden handle with a leather bag on it. And I wonder if that came from that. Or maybe you'll see sometimes it may have like something you have to lift up and put. I always wonder. I'm like, just throw it in something, you know? Just throw it in there and go on. But I think people sometimes maybe they develop weird doctrines from teachings like that. All right, look at verse 3. When thou doest alms, let not thy left hand know what thy right hand doeth, that thine alms may be in secret. And thy Father which is in secret, here it is, he will reward you openly. God blesses those who give. That's the bottom line. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about prayer for a minute. Okay? You know, the Pharisees are sort of a little bit different, I think, in a lot of their beliefs, because everything that they did a lot of times was outwardly, like for show. As you can see on the screen, this is the way a Pharisee would dress. That way he would be identified when he walked through the streets. And everybody that saw him knew who he was. They said, that's one of the Pharisees over there. Pharisee means what? Does anybody know what that means? Separated one. he even liked to be called that by name, you know? He walked through the street with his old holy garments on. A lot of times he's probably doing this number here. Hello. Hello. Good to see you. Well, Jesus talked about the Pharisees and said they love the greetings in the marketplace. They love to be called Rabbi, Rabbi. They desire the chief seats in the synagogues. They had a problem, and it was all to be seen, to say, I'm so special. It's not a good idea for Christians. All right, notice what he says here. When thou prayest, thou shalt not be as the hypocrites are, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and in the corners of the streets, that they may be seen of men. Verily I say unto you, notice, they've got their reward. The prayer is not going past the ceiling. Verse 6. But thou, when thou prayest, enter into thy closet. When thou hast shut thy door, pray to thy Father which is in secret, and thy Father which is in secret shall reward thee openly. But when you pray, use not vain repetitions as the heathen do, for they think that they shall be heard for the much speaking. Now, I looked at this word hypocrites, okay? It says, mentions it several times there, once in verse 5 and in verse 6 as well. I thought it was interesting, this word, because it literally is a combination of two words in the original. The first word is a preposition. It means under. The next word means a character. What do you think that is? A character is in a what? A play. So the word hypocrite means under character. And I'll be honest with you, that's kind of what I see when I see this guy. Something I've always tried to do as a preacher, and I hope, I pray, I'm trying hard. I promise you, I try hard to do this. I want people to know that I am just like you. I got the same struggles you have. I'm trying to make it to heaven just like you are. I do not ever want to be on a totem pole just because they call me the minister. I've never wanted to do that. That's not me. I don't deserve it. I don't want to be any different than anyone else. And this guy here, that's exactly what he wants to be. He wants to be the special one, the most holy person in the room. And I hope when you see me, you see all my faults. You hang around me for 10 minutes, you'll find some. When I stand in that pulpit, I hope that you can see every bit of me. The fact that I love God, yeah, I want you to see that. But I also want you to know, friend, I make mistakes every day. I don't want to be a character.
That's why you call them hypocrites, because they were talking and telling people, teaching people one way to be, and they weren't even being that in their secret lives.
That's true.
And their lives, when not in front of people, they were not that way at all.
Sure enough. Sure enough. And I understand everybody makes mistakes, but this is way different.
Everything.
This guy is doing all of this for a show. Well, that's not a good thing. So, the alms to the poor, the praying, the way that he dresses, all of this. He's sounding a trumpet to say, I'm better than you. That's all it is. Well, Jesus, he's condemning that idea. Interestingly enough, usually you would find something like this on his head. What is that?
Looks like a stamp.
Okay.
Isn't it where they have the markers,
Uh-huh.
the little things that they would pull out and read?
That's right. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, you may remember when he said, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one Lord. Thou shalt love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. Thou shalt love your neighbor as yourself. And he said, These things you will teach unto your children. And you will speak of them when you what? When you walk by the way. When you lie down. When you're sitting in your house, and when you rise up. He said, you will bind these upon the palms of your hands and on the doorpost of your house and upon your gates. And he said, they will be as frontlets between your eyes. So the Pharisee, that's what he did. He would write the scriptures down and he put them in that little box. Maybe throughout the day when he's walking, maybe he's sitting in the pew in the temple. He'd pull out that thing. He'd be praying. Maybe even put his hands up. Who knows what he's doing? He's probably standing on the street corner, doing this number here, and then he'd pull that thing out. And he'd probably bow. Come on. Go ahead. It's good to be holy. God wants people to be holy. No. He don't want you to stick out like a sore thumb. He wants you to be normal. Okay? How can you reach a sinner with that? You can't. He will never convert one person. Did you know that? He will never convert one person when he does that. Because nobody can live like him. There's very few people in the world that want to do what he does. But to just love God and study the Bible and learn and grow and be a sinner saved by the grace of God, everybody wants to do that. There's a lot of people in the world that want to be saved by the grace of God. But Paul said, to the Jew I became as a Jew. To the Greek I became as a Greek. And I became all things to all men, that by all means I might save some. It's interesting to me that same man who said that, guess who he was? He denied that right there. He said, I counted it dung. It was refuse. All of it was refuse to me that I might gain Christ. He said, being a Pharisee, it was nothing. He even told about it. He said, I came from the greatest sect of my religion, being zealous of all the traditions of my fathers. And I counted it for nothing. Go ahead.
Traditions that were not formed by God. They were traditions that they made.
That's true.
They made them.
That's right.
Traditions were not the word.
So Jesus, these are the people he has in mind when he's talking about these very things. All right. As you can see, this is very famous. This is, like you said, modern day. Okay? Modern day Pharisees. Jesus said this, the scribes and the Pharisees, they sit at Moses' seat, and all therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that they observe and do, but do not after their works. Okay? It's interesting what he's saying is, he said, listen to what they're saying from God, but don't listen to them. Don't listen to them and what they're saying that's not from God, because there's a lot of it that's not. He said, but after their works, for they say and they do not. They bind heavy burdens, grievous to be borne. They lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. All their works they do to be seen of men. They make broad their phylacteries, enlarge the borders of their garments. They love the uppermost roofs and feasts, chief seats in the synagogues and greetings in the markets, and to be called Rabbi, Rabbi. All right. Let me find my spot here. I found this about hypocrites. I want to share it with you. I always like to put something humorous in there, make the mood a little bit lighter. But it says, hypocrite, someone who conveniently forgets their faults to point out someone else's. How many of us have ever been guilty of that before? I'll be honest with you, I've done that. And I should not have. And I try not to. I don't want to do that. And I'll just tell you straight up right now, I've got too many problems of my own to be worried about other people's. You with me? Same's true with all of us. I like this one. These are being hypocritical. One of them called the other one fat. We usually say the pot calling the kettle black. That's a hypocrite. All right. Let's move on.
Yeah, going into chapter 7, they talk about hypocrite. Jesus tells about, one verse 2 through 6 or 7.
That's right. And Sunday, I'm going to begin in chapter 7. I had planned on getting through all this, but we're not going to notice all of it. But Sunday, I'm going to begin in chapter 7, verse 1. Notice, I'm glad you brought that up. Notice what he says here. Judge not that you be not judged. For with what judgment you judge, you shall be judged, and with what measure you meet, it shall be measured to you again. How many of your versions say something different there for verse 1? I'm just curious. Do any of yours say, condemn not? I've never seen it, I'm just wondering. That's literally the root of that word there. Basically, what he's saying is, don't go around putting your finger in people's faces. It's not good to point out people's wrongs. All right, let's move on. How many of you are familiar with this? Do we have any Catholic converts in here? Okay. If you were Catholic, this would be very important to you. They call this a Holy Rosary, and each one of these little beads here, it represents a prayer. And by the time you've been in the Catholic Church for so long, you're supposed to have memorized all that. Okay? You got to go through a special school. And they teach you things like that. You're supposed to memorize these prayers on the rosary. So what they do is they would memorize this and they would recite it, I guess, every day or multiple times a day or whenever they're in stress or, things like that. But that creates a little bit of a problem because it then begins a prayer that is not from here. You see, that's what Jesus said these people were doing. Notice here, if you continue, verse 7, Matthew chapter 6, verse 7. When you pray, do not use vain repetitions as the heathen do, for they think that they shall be heard for the much speaking. And be not therefore like unto them, for your Father knoweth what things you need of before you ask Him. What he's saying is, I want your prayer to be genuine. You want to talk to God like you're talking to your Holy Father, not just saying things over and over again. Now, I thought it interesting that he used the word heathen. He said, do not use vain repetitions like the heathen do. What does that mean? Say what now? Non-believers, yes. This would specifically be like non-believers and Gentiles. This is not your teenage children, okay? You old heathen. No.
These were probably the way they worshiped their false idols and gods, the way they...
That's right. You're exactly right. In fact, you'll find some of this in the scriptures that teach about this, okay? I've got this in the ESV because I like it better for this verse. And I'll tell you why in a minute. But look here, it says, they took the bull that was given them, they prepared it and called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, O Baal, answer us. But there was no voice, and no one answered, and they limped around the altar that they had made. I don't like the King James translation on that. It says that they leaped upon the altar. That is not what they did, okay? I think this is a little more accurate. In fact, the prophet, he spoke to them and he asked them, how long will you halt between two opinions? How long will you limp between two opinions? That's what he asked them. He said, if God be God, then serve Him. And if Baal be God, then serve him. And then he called out to God, and God sent fire on that altar, and it just burned it up. They had been calling on Baal all day, from morning until noon. So, you'll notice, all that time, from morning until noon, that's what they were saying. Oh bell, answer us. Oh, bell, answer us. For 4 hours. Over and over and over. So I think that's a little bit of the idea of what Jesus is talking about. You read about this in the New Testament. Acts chapter 19 verse 34, when they recognized he was a Jew, for about 2 hours they all cried out with one voice, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." For 2 hours, over and over and over and over. That's what they said. Well, Artemis of the Ephesians wasn't great because he didn't even exist. He was somebody that they made up. He was an idol. Well, Jesus is talking about that. When the heathen pray, those people who worship those idols, he said that's what they do. They just say things over and over and over. But God wants it from here. So, is it wrong to write your prayer down? No. No. That's not what Jesus is talking about. You know, some of the best prayers that I've heard are from men who got up in that pulpit right there and they had their prayer written down on a piece of paper. You with me? And the night before they knew they had to lead the prayer, they were so nervous, they sat down at home and they wrote everything out that they wanted to say. But it came from right here. Some of the sweetest prayers you'll ever hear are some of those prayers. Friend, that's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, I want it to be from your heart. I don't want you to just say the same thing over and over again. Now, I'll be honest with you. I could get up there and say something not written down, and it'd be the same thing I pray all the time. You know? It could just be the same old thing over and over. I could do that daily. So whether it's on paper or not, God says, I want you. I want you to tell me about what's going on. You know, one of the hardest things in our family about having multiple children and just the days are busy like most of you. You know, all of us are usually like that. But in our home, personally, I'll share with you that we have trouble just saying, what did you do today? You know, how was your day at school? And I'll tell you, I'll be honest with you, I do not remember the last time we sat down as a family and had a meal together. I hate that. I told my wife one day, I said, our children are going to grow up and they're going to remember we never sat down and ate a meal together. It's just crazy. Like, you know, we come home, we try to fix their food. We're like, all right, you sit here, eat, you eat, you eat. All right, it's time to go get in the bath. Let's get your homework. It's constant all the time. So that's a battle we have. It's not easy. I want to be able to say, I want to know you. That's what God is saying. All right, we'll continue this next time.